What is the current status of reopening schools?
I think it's important for when we're talking about opening schools that we actually need to move away from the language of open and closed. I think that's part of what's causing so much confusion for our families, for our teachers, because as we enter this new school year, we are completely rethinking the education system. In this COVID era, our education, our teaching and learning looks very different than it has in any prior year. So when we talk about open and close, it doesn't really get into the details of what's actually happening. So for example, our schools have already started in Arizona. We already have distance learning, whether that's online teaching or packets and teachers reaching out to students. So teaching and learning has already begun in Arizona. So in that regard, our schools are open. The teaching is already happening. But on the other hand, they're not in the classroom. And so there's this gray area, and our teachers are going above and beyond to help redesign the education system under these incredibly challenging circumstances. And so I think that hopefully that helps people to understand a little bit that it's not just about when our schools open or close, it's more what are we doing in this in-between area.
Mm-hmm. And so that August 17th date that was originally set as we're gonna hope that we can get kids and students back on campus by then. Does that date have any merit anymore?
So the August 17th date is still significant because we are using that date as a starting point for on-site services to begin. And so that, when we developed the executive order, one thing that was important was that there essentially be a safety net for kids who need it the most. That for many of our students, schools are the safest place for them to be, and there's critical services that our schools provide. And so some of those are special education services, counseling services, and those types of supports that some of our students really need. And so to me, I think of it as a matter of life and death for some of our students, that they need some of those school services. And so we are using that date as a way to say that, that we do want some level of safety net supports to be beginning at that time.
So, and this is just to clarify, so schools should not be opening for traditional in-person instruction before August 17th.
So again, so to get a little bit into the nuances again, so from the August 17th date, the other component to that is that for schools or districts that are ready to open their doors for in-person instruction, there's nothing to stop them at that point from doing so. We want them to be using the data and the research and the metrics that the Department of Health Services will be providing. But for example, I know I've talked with, for example, the superintendent of Globe has told me that starting August 17th, they intend to open as a hybrid model. So they will have a portion of their students online distance learning, and then a portion of their students that will be coming in for in-person instruction. That is his plan. So I just want to be cautious when there's going to be so many different models across the state, and it's going to look very different in every community. And part of the purpose behind the executive order was to empower our districts to be making those decisions, that what works in their communities. Are they able to open their schools in a way that's safe for students, safe for teachers and staff, and making sure they're accommodating the needs of our vulnerable populations? So there's going to be so many different models around the state, and that's why it is really complex and confusing.
Sure. Those benchmarks that the Department of Health Services is working on, I know those are due out by August 7th. What's the status of those, and what do you expect that to include?
We had been in communication with the Department of Health Services about producing benchmarks or metrics prior to this executive order. So they had already begun that work in researching different types of metrics, and we have been working closely with them, talking with them on a couple times a week basis to make sure we're in close communication with them. So we expect that they will start to have some draft metrics and framework for us to review by the end of this week. What we're cautious of is to not rush this process, because we want to make sure that there's a very smooth rollout of when we have the metrics and the framework available for our schools. So while as much as I know our schools and our teachers wanted those metrics a week ago, 2 weeks ago. There's a lot of impatience and frustration about not having the metrics yet, but at the same time, it's going to be so critical that we make sure, and this is what the Department of Health Services is doing, is making sure that the metrics that they determine to be best for our schools are sustainable and that it's reliable data, and that our school leaders will believe in these metrics in a way that is most useful for them and for their entire communities, to have trust that when the schools meet, when the school and that community meets those benchmarks and metrics, that then people will feel safe and trust in the metrics enough to know, okay, it is safe for us to re-enter and have more in-person instruction.
And for districts, as they are navigating those benchmarks, I think some parents are concerned, is there accountability? Is there an extra step there where a district, do they have to get approval to reopen, or are we just kind of trusting that districts are going to make the best decisions based on those metrics?
So prior, in absence of these metrics, it was up to the school governing boards to be making these types of decisions on their own. And we've seen that, where we've had several districts across the state, not just in urban areas, but even in urban area or rural areas, that have pushed back their start date and said, we're going to do distance learning until at least October. So having these metrics is so critically important, and we've been also meeting regularly with the county health departments, because we do want this. We are also working to empower the county health departments to be working closely in partnership with the school leaders and the governing boards to guide them, because ultimately it should not be our educational leaders who are making these public health decisions. They should be guided and directed using the metrics in partnership with the trained epidemiologists to make these types of decisions.
I think there's a gray area regarding face coverings in schools. So does that executive order essentially mandate face coverings in every school in Arizona?
Yes, it does mandate face coverings for all K-12 schools across the state for any child over the age of 5. There are some exemptions built into that for students that might have medical conditions or disabilities, for example, but generally, yes. And there was a request for that type of policy from some of our school leaders in communities where they did not have a county or city ordinance requiring face coverings, and they asked Governor Ducey for that type of policy to cover the entire state.
I think schools are nervous about opening campuses if they don't know yet what the protocol is for if and when someone on campus gets coronavirus. Mm-hmm. When will that guidance come out? Is that being worked on right now? What's the status of that?
So the Department of Health Services is working on that. I do not know personally at this time exactly when their expected delivery date is for that guidance, but they have been working on it. As far as I know, they're in the final process of just making the final edits to that to be ready for distribution to our schools. If
someone on a school campus gets coronavirus, is there a notification process? Will that data be public so that people can find it if they're interested?
I would want to double check this process, okay. But typically for any type of outbreak, whether it's COVID or even prior if there was a measles mm-hmm. case or whooping cough case, typically those are reported to the county health offices, but I don't know to what degree those are made public.
Okay, so that might be circle back with county public health. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that. All right. You touched on that in-person in-person supports mm-hmm. requirement on August 17th. Can you talk a little more about what students qualify for that and mm-hmm. how districts are supposed to go about selecting which students they can offer that to?
So we are working on producing more clarity and guidance. I know this was one of the top requests that we've heard from school districts since the executive order was announced, was the request to us to produce more guidance and clarity around that. So we're in the process of developing guidance documents and webinars. But just to speak broadly about it, the way the executive order was written is empowering our school districts and governing boards to be determining and making some determinations around defining that, about defining which of their students are most at need for these on-site support services. So I know that this is a challenge, and I know we're also very aware that there are communities in our state that still have very high spread of COVID. And so in those cases, if it's a particular community where the county health department can confirm this area is at high risk, high community spread, then we are also in the process of developing a waiver system for the school that is designed for those types of very localized outbreaks in which they could receive a waiver from the Department of Education to not provide on-site services. We do want that to be rare, hopefully, that we hope there's not too many cases where that will be necessary, but we also acknowledge there have been some communities where there is very high risk, and so we just want to be cautious, and everything we do is with the safety of our teachers and staff and our students to make sure that we are doing everything possible from the state perspective of creating safe environments.
We've gotten a lot of questions from parents who have kids with special needs about, if they would be considered for those in-person supports. Is there a group of students, as far as special needs students at risk, is there any definition assigned to that just yet?
So the way we've been messaging it, and again, we will be providing more clarity in the near future, but the way we have been messaging that does include students with disabilities who receive special education services. Also, schools could be considering students with mental health needs. I know I've talked to some school leaders who they plan to offer daily counseling sessions for students that need it. So another way that we're planning on helping our schools and families to know what to expect from this is we've been reaching out to a couple superintendents to ask them, how are you planning for this? What types of services do you plan on offering? And so we're currently collecting those types of plans so that we can amplify them and share with other communities and schools of here's some ideas, here's some tools to help you identify which students in your community need these services. And I do think we should be mindful, because I know maybe one area of confusion has also been that a group of what would be considered more at-risk, vulnerable students does include students who are going to Title I schools and more low-income areas and working families. But from what I've heard from our schools is when they survey their families, even in 100% Title I districts or schools, the response is still that only maybe 50% of the families want in-person types of opportunities for their kids. So I think we should be cautious not to make assumptions that just because, or even for, this also applies for kids with disabilities, that they may have a medical condition. For a child with a disability might also be more vulnerable, and maybe it's not safe for them to be in a classroom with other adults and kids. So I think that we should just also be cautious not to make assumptions that just because a child might fall into one of those areas of need, or that we might think they might be more at risk, that we shouldn't necessarily assume that that's what the family wants. So we do want to build in those flexibilities. We want our schools to be asking their families, what services do you need for your child, and to build out from there.
Sure. And that's where it comes down to the districts having to make the best decisions for their individual families.
Exactly.
Got it. Lately, I'd say.
Can I actually add one more thing to because this is still being developed by our school districts, I just want to acknowledge that that's very hard on our families who are waiting for answers. They want clear answers. Is my child qualifying for this type of on-site, in-person services? And there's a lot of anxiety and impatience and frustration because our parents, they are demanding those answers from schools, as rightfully so. We all want answers. So I just want to acknowledge that in this process of giving schools the flexibility to help build this out, and with such limited time to do so, that it is causing a lot of pressure between our families and communities and the school leaders who are making these very challenging decisions. So I think what I would encourage for all of us is to be as adaptable as possible, and for our schools to be continuing to communicate with their families about where they're at in the process, and for us all to just remember to be kind and be patient as these very challenging decisions continue to be made as quickly as possible. But we've had 3 back-to-back education executive orders, and the last one only being last Thursday, and so every time there's an executive order, it's like whiplash for our school leaders as they try to understand it, and we're working on getting guidance to them, and they're working on making these decisions as quickly as possible. But in that time of adjusting to the new policies that the state is requiring of our schools causes a lot of frustration for our families, and I just want to acknowledge that that's really hard. And I've been encouraging our school leaders to continue to communicate and be adaptable, but just want to acknowledge that that's where some of that emotion comes from too.
And I think yesterday was an interesting example, because here at the Capitol we had a group in the morning saying, you know, it's downright dangerous to even think of reopening schools, and then later that night we had a group of parents out there rallying to reopen schools. And so this has become such a divisive issue in the community. I mean, how do you even attempt to have a middle ground there? I mean, it's difficult.
It's very difficult. I think it is very challenging when everyone is looking to different types of information, and whether you're watching the news or you're looking on social media and you're talking to your friends, and everyone's getting different information, and everyone has a personal decision to make, when, especially for our parents and families, that is a very personal decision about whether you feel safe for your child to be in the school building again under these circumstances. And also for every family, when do you feel safe again? Or for every teacher, what does it take? What conditions does it take for you to feel comfortable and safe to be back in the school environment again? And it is because it's so personal, and because there's so much information from different places, that is a challenge for us to all be aware of as well.
Why isn't it that simple to just shut down campuses for a prolonged period of time?
I understand the need and for our whole community to want that certainty and clarity about when schools will open. When will we go back to normal? When will it be safe again? That's on everyone's mind. That's on my mind. It keeps me up at night knowing that this is a very different school year, and that not every child has the same quality of access to the education that we want them to have under these very difficult circumstances. So I think I understand why people are craving for that simple answer of what's the date, when are schools going to open, why can't it just be October, why can't it just be January? But from a policy perspective, there's so many different nuances, and that's why it's really important to look to the public health data and to have that framework and those metrics for our schools to be making those determinations based on the available public health data, because without that, the date isn't really meaningful, and every community across the state could look very different. So for example, we've already seen where some of the highest outbreaks have been. So for example, Navajo Nation was hit so hard in the spring, or we've seen high numbers in Yuma, high numbers in Nogales. So from the state level, we want to be really cautious in making a whole statewide policy when we need to drill down a little bit more and see what the actual context is, to see, is this outbreak impacting our schools in that community, or is it more isolated, or is it even within a county? Maricopa County is huge, so there's the potential that there could be one side of the county where there's an outbreak, and another side of the county where there's not, and where schools could safely open. And ultimately, our shared goal is for schools to be open, and no matter how that looks, no matter if that's a hybrid model with some kids online and some kids in the classroom, or getting to that point when we can fully open and fully get back to in-person instruction, that's our shared goal because of all the critical services that our schools provide in the school environment that our kids need. But in order to get there, we need to be paying really close attention to the public health data rather than sticking a date on it, because if we stuck a date on it, then we probably just have to keep revisiting the date and keep coming out with new executive orders, which again is just such a jolt to the whole community and causes a lot of confusion. So instead, we're empowering our school districts to be using that public health data to make informed decisions.
Yeah, and you really pushed for that data, for those data-driven decisions. How do you feel about the actions that the state has taken recently, and what more do you think needs to be done?
in terms of the data or other action?
Well, I
in
guess,
general?
we saw you push for more aggressive action as far as encouraging people to wear masks
Mm-hmm.
and pushing for that data-driven decision-making model. How do you feel about the recent, the recent steps taken by the state, and do you think the state needs to be doing more as far as whether it's masks or, guiding the districts, any actions that you think need to be taken?
So with this recent executive order, and when we have the framework and the metrics from the Department of Health Services that we can all point to, I hope at that point that Arizona rallies behind those metrics and that we set that as a goal, that if we all agree we want our schools to be open, we want our communities to be safe, for teachers and students to be back in the classroom, then we all need to work together to rally behind those metrics and to do everything we can in our personal lives to help us get there. I think a lot about the lost opportunities that our students are missing out on by in this situation where they are required to learn from home, and that weighs really heavily on me on a daily basis, thinking about students who, something I loved in high school was doing science experiments, but you can't do that at home usually, or music, going to music class and having a violin or a guitar and having these different instruments that you have in the school building. And most of our students don't have a wide range of musical instruments at home to learn from and to work on. So I think that I would just encourage Arizonans to be thinking about, it is our shared goal for our students to be back in the schools where they have this wide range of opportunities, where they can go play soccer with their school team, where they can have an assembly. And if we all make that our shared common goal of getting kids and teachers back into the classroom where we can all convene in our school communities again, and we rally around these metrics, then I think that we'll actually see faster progress as a community of getting to a place where our COVID numbers are much lower.
Have you seen the metrics, or are you talking with them about what might go into those metrics?
I have not seen the current status of the metrics, but I know that they've been evaluating the other types of metrics that have been coming out from across. There's been different models coming out, so from the White House, from New York, from other states that have already developed some metrics for reopening schools. Mm-hmm. They have compiled all those, they are evaluating them. So I've seen some trends in what those metrics are. It could be looking at number of new COVID cases, it could be the percent of positivity cases. One thing I've also heard from our school leaders is the importance of quick turnaround in test results, because the way that impacts our schools is that if it takes a week for someone to get their test results back, then that's a whole week that is in question, that they can't be at work for that, if it's a teacher or a staff person for that school, that while they're waiting it's really hard. It's really hard to move forward and to know, do we need to do contact tracing and all these other things. So that's something that I've heard from school leaders that I would hope would be included as well. What
would you say to families, or teachers for that matter, to give them confidence in the upcoming school year with so much still unknown?
The way I would message to our families and teachers is to think about how this school year is going to be completely different. We are rethinking education, we are redesigning. We need to do that in partnership, not just from the Department of Education, not just from the superintendent or the school board level. We need all of our teachers, all of our parents being partners. And what does that look like? What does the future of education in Arizona look like, especially under these COVID-19 circumstances? And in order to do so, in order to have a strong partnership in moving forward together, we need to be adaptable. I just keep coming back to this adaptability piece, because as I've said before, we have no way of predicting what this will look like in October, in December, next summer. We don't know. There's no way for us to predict. If I went back to several months ago, I would have thought we'd be in a much different place today. I expected schools to be opening this fall, but we're not there. And so it's really important for us to be thinking in that mindset of being flexible and adaptable and knowing that we're not going to get all the answers immediately. It's not going to be an easy answer. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be, we're going to do everything we can to plan, and then the plans are going to have to change. Even with the metrics, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that these metrics and framework are the best possible for our schools. But maybe down the road we need to look at it again and adjust and tweak. So I think for us to have a really strong school year and to have confidence in what that school year will look like, we need to go into the school year knowing it's going to be completely different, it's going to be hard, we're going to have to rise to the occasion and work together and over communicate with each other about our needs and what do we need to feel safe, what kinds of accommodations do we need for our teachers and staff to feel safe, for our kids to feel safe, and it's going to take a lot of work together as a community to get there.
Are we even close to that, of being able to say, okay, we feel comfortable that schools may be opening up on August 17th or pretty soon here in the next few weeks?
I think it just depends again on the community and the context of that community circumstances, because there are schools that are communicating, we're ready to open, it's not going to be the same, we're going to have some kids online, we're going to have some kids in person. Some schools that are very enthusiastic about providing those supports to students in need. I've spoken to teachers who would just love to be back in the classroom and providing that, but then also the teachers who do not feel safe, do not feel comfortable. So it's really hard to walk that line, knowing there's such different feelings and so many personal decisions being made around this. So again, what I'm expecting as we get closer to August 17th and beyond is we're going to see a lot of variability across the state, from district to district or school to school. There's going to be a lot of different models, a lot of different ideas and innovation and programs and services. It is going to look different across the state.
Can you kind of lay out the additional funding supports that are provided in the executive order?
Mm-hmm. So the funding model is very complicated, and that's where it again causes some confusion in the field. But what the main message that I want to share, to reassure our teachers and our schools, is that in this last executive order, one of the components was ensuring full funding for distance learning, and part of how that's being funded is using CARES Act funding to make up the difference of any budget shortfalls. Another component of that was ensuring that all of our teachers, and as well as our classified staff, which includes our bus drivers, our cafeteria workers, the front office staff, people who are paid hourly, we knew that we needed a provision in there as well to make sure that there was continuity of pay, and to again have some flexibility for our districts to be thoughtful in how people are serving their students in this distance learning era. But both of those pieces are a huge win that we fought so hard for, and just not to brag on Arizona, because we do have a history, and thinking of the past decade where there were many cuts to public education. Where we are today compared to many other states in the country is astonishing. That I speak with other state education leaders across the country. Most of them are facing significant budget cuts, upwards of 20% cuts to public education. And here in Arizona, we're not. We have guaranteed budget stability for our schools to make sure that no matter where a student is learning, whether they're distance learning at home or whether they're in the classroom, that they will be fully funded, and our schools have the resources and the stability they need to move forward and to make sure that we're starting the year strong.